So the title of the message tonight, which I don't normally give a title because I don't ever know how far I'm going to get with the notes that I have before me. And oftentimes I don't get as far, and so we end and we pick up there later. But the title to the message tonight is this: why is the tribe of Dan missing? Question mark. And so finally we will get somewhere, as someone probably is thinking. Finally we will get somewhere. Well, this is obviously, if you don't know, I will clue you in, why everyone is curious about John's first vision in Revelation 7. And it is not why I am curious about John's vision. I'm curious about John's vision because of the sealing of the 144,000, because I think that's what this vision is about. The sealing of the 144,000. Who are they? When does this happen? Why are they sealed? What are they going to do? Where do they live? Where do they travel? And as I've said earlier, not all those questions, unfortunately, are answered for us, but that is what this first vision is about. However, if you go on YouTube or you listen to sermons delivered in person, or you read books, or you look up articles on the 144,000, probably 70% of the time, I don't know really, that's just a guess, maybe it's less than that, the direction that people go in is to the missing tribe of Dan. That's where everybody goes. So one of the reasons, or maybe the reason, why we have spent so much time talking about the 12 sons who became the 12 family groups, who became the 12 tribes, kind of in Exodus. That's just their formation. And then as they move out into the wilderness and they begin to encamp around the tabernacle, then we do have 12 tribes, and then they go into the promised land, and then the land is divided into 12 allotments for the 12 tribes. Then we see, wow, these 12 sons of Jacob are integral to Israel's history. Unlike any other people, you just have a nationality of Americans or French or English or Spanish. You just have a nationality, but Israel is different. Israel, from the last half of the book of Genesis, is all wrapped up in these 12 sons and these 12 tribes. And from the last half of the book of Genesis to the next to last chapter in the Bible, in the eternal state, this never ceases to amaze me, and I always take notice of this, that in the new heavens and the new earth, when the heavenly Jerusalem descends to the new earth, it has a great city with 4 walls and with 12 gates. And on those 12 gates are the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. So it is just fascinating how that can be. How can that be long after the death and burial and resurrection of Christ, long after the day of Pentecost, long after the establishment of the church, which for the most part, as we progress in Luke's history and Acts, became a Gentile church, because Paul would go into the synagogues, Paul would try to reason with the Jewish population there, and 9 times out of 10, and that's probably not an exaggeration, 9 times out of 10, they rejected the message. And so he even said in the end of his sermon in the Acts 13, his first long sermon at Antioch up in Pisidia, he said, well, from henceforth we will go to the Gentiles. Now that didn't mean he never went back, because his pattern was as soon as he got to a new city, he would go into the Jewish synagogue and try to reason with the Jews. But they would often reject. He would go to the God-fearers, and then he would go to the Gentiles who were even outside of the synagogue. So my point in saying all that is, this time that we have studied on the 12 tribes is not just wasted time. I think it should give all of us just a better, no, not a level of expertise, but just like, yeah, I've got a feel for the 12 sons. I know there were 2 wives, and then there were 2 concubines or handmaids. You might not remember who was born from whom. That's okay, you just have a feel for that. They went down into Egypt as 70 souls, according to Exodus 1. They multiplied and multiplied. By the time they come out in Exodus 14, in the deliverance from Egypt, now they are several million strong. And as we get later into the Pentateuch, as I've given you in some of these charts and pictures and divisions, we see we've actually got 12 tribes. And then we also saw how that wasn't enough of a knowledge, because all of a sudden Levi disappears. We only have 11 tribes, and we saw why Levi was taken out. And in order to get that number 12 back, we saw how that happened because of Joseph's heroic effort in all the years he spent in prison in Egypt. And then because he was a righteous man, God in his providence exalted him to control over all the land, second only to Pharaoh. Then he was able to save his brothers and his family and save the entire posterity of the nation of Israel. And so God rewarded him and said, you will have a double portion. And then we saw as he brought his 2 sons, Manasseh and Ephraim, to his father Jacob to bless, he had Ephraim under his right hand and Manasseh under his left hand, and he put them forward to Jacob to bless, so that Jacob's right hand would go on Manasseh and Jacob's left hand would go on Ephraim. Jacob was blind, basically, by this time. But the Holy Spirit was on Jacob, the patriarch, and even though he was blind, he crossed his hands and he put the right hand of blessing on the younger son, Ephraim. And Joseph said, Father, you're doing it wrong. And he said, I know, my son, I know. And Manasseh will be blessed, but Ephraim will be the chief tribe. And that is exactly what we see in the history of Israel as it's developed in the Old Testament. So with verses 5 through 8 in Revelation 7, we have John's list of the 12 tribes. And quick review, we know that no tribes were ever lost. We looked at all the passages and arguments about that. No tribes were ever lost. None are lost today. That was the second argument that people had. And the third one is there are no irregularities in this list because there is no regular, standard list of the 12 tribes in the Old Testament. Every time there's a list, and there are 18 to 20, just say there are 24, they all differ from one another in some form or fashion. So if there's no standard list, you can't say, well, now this is not a standard list, so there must be something going on, and maybe we shouldn't take this literally. Maybe we should take this figuratively. But simply because there is no irregularity, doesn't mean this list is not without its distinctives. And those distinctives are what draw everyone's attention. So what are those distinctives? That's what we're coming to tonight. What may we learn from those distinctives? Every list has a distinctive. Maybe it starts with the first son and the next list starts with the seventh son. They all have some distinctive. What are the distinctives of this list, and what may we learn from them? That is where we begin our investigation tonight. So I said before, just to remind you, and this is where we're going right now, that when it comes to the list, the differences have to do with either the what I just call the order of arrangements, the way in which they're listed, the order of arrangements, or that's one way that the lists differ from one another, the order of arrangements, who's first, who's second, who's third, and who's last, as well as who is excluded and who is included. So it's the order, it's the exclusions, and it's the inclusions. So we're going to start, first of all, on the order of arrangement. So we have Judah. This is the order. Reuben, Gad, Asher, Naphtali, Manasseh, Simeon, Levi, Issachar, Zebulun, Joseph, Benjamin. And I don't know if I missed one or not, but you see, you can read, there is the order of arrangement. If there ever would be a standard order of arrangement, which there isn't, the only one that I would have ever thought would have even been possible would have just been the order of birth. So you do Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, and you'd end with Joseph and Benjamin. That would make sense to me. If you're going to have a standard list, that would be the standard list. But it's never given that way, except when they're actually born as sons. The later lists never give it to us in their chronological order. So the order of arrangement is always different. We don't always know the reason for that. And I don't know that anybody always knows the reason why each time the list is given, it's given in a different order. But just because we don't know the reason, I wouldn't say that means there is no reason. I would say there probably are reasons that are practical, they're political, they're military, they're familial. They have to do with who is a full brother and who is a half brother. There are probably reasons for that, and we don't necessarily know what those are. But let me just give you one example. Do you still have with you all of your lists and charts and pictures? And this is probably the last night you're going to need them. But if you have this one, the 12, it starts with the 12 sons of Jacob or Israel up at the tops. It's got the mothers and the order of birth, and then it has these 4 vertical columns. Look at that last one, how they encamped. And that's based on Numbers chapter 2, how they encamped. I'll just give you one example of maybe an explanation for why they encamped this way. And I'm not saying this is right, but I'm just saying I think if we took our time and worked hard enough on all the lists, maybe you could come up with a reason, maybe not. And I've got a little cheat sheet here because I have to have this in my hand. So here's how they encamped. So we have out in the wilderness, we have the tabernacle. And then the first 3 tribes are Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. Okay, they're over here on the east side. And then whoever the next 3 are on the south. The next 3 are on the west. The next 3 are on the north. If you go and read that chapter, here's what the population totals. So, you can do all kinds of investigations. So here's what for these 3 tribes, the population is 186,400. It's going to be the largest contingency around the tabernacle. And the one on the south is 151,450. The one on the west, you add up those 3 tribes, 113,100, and on the north is 157,600.
Is this population of individuals 20 years or older? If it was total population, I thought they had was about millions.
Yes, it would be the fighting men. The fighting men within that group of those 3 tribes. So tribes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so forth. So, and I'm just saying this.
It says that in Scripture. It says that fighting men. I remember it saying.
I think so.
It tells you the population of what group of people.
Yes. And these are the men who are guarding the tabernacle. The tabernacle is here in the middle, and this is the way that they encamp. So here's just a possibility, and I got to go quickly. I can't stay long on this because we have a long way to go tonight. They came out of Egypt, way over here. And on the other map, or another map, this one, the wilderness journey, they're basically traveling south and east and north and east. They're not really too concerned about the west, what's behind them. This is, and notice the western contingent is the smallest one. Because what did God do with Pharaoh and all of his host? He wiped them out. There's nobody they have to worry about from the west side. So it is interesting that they continue to head east, although it is southeast, I realize, and then northeast. It's still, they're continuing to head east, and notice where the biggest number of people are. So that is simply just a hypothesis, and trust me, it's only a hypothesis a way to explain why they encamped in that order. I'm sure there's a reason. It's either this reason or a better reason than this, why they encamped in that order. Another reason why we may be given the tribes in a certain order, I'm just going to give you another example just to show you that there are probably reasons why the tribes are listed the way they are. It's just I'm not smart enough to figure it out, and I also have other things I would like to spend my spare time studying. And that has to do with familial bonds, as I mentioned here a few moments ago, brother to brother. So if you want to pull out the allotments, the 12 tribes, this color picture that I had given you before. And then you also will probably, because you might not remember who the full brothers are, then you'll have to have this one as well. And it's interesting to see, it's not always true, but it's interesting to see where the full brothers are in relation to one another. And it only makes sense. You're a full brother. They all have the same father, but there's 4 different mothers. And you are simply closer. You're closer if you come from the same father and the same mother. And so look at here. We have Reuben was a firstborn, then Simeon, then Levi, which is scattered around the and then Judah. We have all 3 of those right there together. Zebulun and Issachar, little tribes up north who touch each other. They have the same mother.
And father.
Yeah, same mother and father. They all have the same father, but these have the same mother. Ephraim and Manasseh, the sons of Joseph, they touch each other. Ephraim and Manasseh, and then you have Manasseh over here. Now, it doesn't necessarily work for every one of these, but it's just one example of it's interesting how so many of the tribal allotments, they ended up anyway in the providence of God having full brothers with a tribal allotment beside a full brother. Now, when it comes to our list in Revelation 7, I don't know why they're given in this order. I don't see anything in the text that tells me why they're given in this order. But not a few people think that they see the reason why the list begins with Judah. So I'm reading from a commentary that I've read from before, and it goes like this. First tribe mentioned is Judah rather than Reuben. He heads the list. The reason for this is obvious. I don't think it's obvious. I think it doesn't tell us. So whatever you say could be true. And it may well be true. But I couldn't say that it's obvious. The reason for this change is obvious because Christ belonged to the tribe of Judah. He was from the tribe of Judah. We saw that in Revelation chapter 5 we studied earlier. So giving this priority to Judah would be perfectly natural for a Christian writer. And then here I just copy down another person's statement. They said it is very distinctly a Christian list because it begins with Judah. Well, again, maybe that's true. I mean, I would like for it to be true. It sounds good. It sounds good, but it's just a theory. It is just a theory that the list begins with Judah because it's a Christian list, or at least it begins as a Christian list. I don't know how you could argue the whole list is a Christian list. All you could argue is it begins with the first tribe as a Christian list, and then, who knows where it goes from there. The same person that I just quoted who said this is a distinctly Christian list because it begins with Judah also made these 2 statements. Ephraim and Dan, we know we don't see those names here in that list, will be excluded from the New Jerusalem. Well, says who, says what, says where? And then the proof text was Revelation 22:15. You can go look at that. I don't see that saying that Ephraim and Dan will be excluded. And the same person also said that the reason that Joseph is mentioned instead of Ephraim is that Joseph is a type of Christ. Well, look, I just mentioned those as there are ways in which Joseph is a type of Christ, but the Bible itself doesn't make that connection and tell us Joseph is a type of Christ in that he saved his people, and that is why his name is in the list. I just think we need to be very careful when we say, well, this is a possibility, and when we say, well, it's very obvious that this is true, because it is simply not that obvious. So enough of the order of arrangement. The order of arrangement to me is, in all of these, is never as important as the second and third areas, and that's the exclusions. You know, we're gonna take out the minuses and the inclusions, and who we're gonna add. That is a much more important factor, I think, a much more important factor in this list. And the truth may be easier to get at, and simply in looking at this, now we're actually really getting somewhere. So where everyone is going, hence the title of the message, why is the tribe of Dan missing? Here's a tribe of Dan, and he does not appear in this list. There is no mention of Dan. This garners all of the attention, and this generates all of the heat and the sweat and the friction and the activity whenever anyone studies this. They want to know, Dan, mysterious. And normally you see the big M word, mystery or mysterious. Everything's mystery, everything's a mystery or mysterious when it comes to Dan not being here. Why is Dan not here? And evidently, because Dan has been taken out, then we have Levi. So Dan is a minus and Levi is a plus. And that's probably what's happening in the list. Dan is gone. Levi is brought back in. And then here is the other interesting thing that does not generate that much interest. By the way, Levi's inclusion generates no interest. Nobody has anything to say about that. And that's just as big as Dan being gone, Levi being brought back in. No interest at all. Second in interest would be Ephraim, but it's minuscule. All the interest is about Dan. So here's what happens. I'll draw it. I thought, how can I show you what's happening here? Here's what seems to be happening. If Ephraim, did I spell that right? Ephraim, do you see him in the list? No, right? He's not there. So this seems to be what's happening. Seems to be subsumed underneath the name of Joseph. In other words, Ephraim is still there, apparently. Because what would you mean by Joseph? If Joseph's two sons are Ephraim and Manasseh, and we have Manasseh, and now we have Joseph, then what else could Joseph mean but Ephraim? But Ephraim, so he's not excluded in the sense that Dan was, but he is hidden. He is subsumed under or behind the name of his father.
If you're a descendant of Ephraim, you're a descendant of Joseph. So if he said Joseph, then I see what you're saying.
But if you're a descendant of Manasseh, you're also a descendant of Joseph. So that he mentions Manasseh. Manasseh seems to be, those are Manassites. But there seem to be Ephraimites, but he doesn't want to mention their name. So that's very interesting. I mean, it's very curious. So it's a totally different situation than Dan. Dan's just gone. Right. Dan's not hidden somewhere, unless you say he's hidden in Levi. No one's ever said that. Dan is just gone. Dan is totally gone, and Levi is brought in. Ephraim is there, but he's hidden behind the name of his father. So we have these two different things happening that involve four different tribes. Dan is omitted, Levi is put in. The name of Ephraim is dropped, but he's included evidently, indirectly, through the use of the name Joseph. So the big question, guys, is this. Why? Why is Dan gone, Levi brought in, and equally as important, why does he not mention the name Ephraim? Why does he evidently include that tribe, but he wants to do it indirectly and without mentioning? Well, you have the same Bible I have. You have the same 9 verses. Do you see the answer anywhere in those 9 verses? Unfortunately, the text doesn't say, does it? And unfortunately, the text doesn't even hint at it. I mean, we all have the same Bible. Those are the verses. The text or the context doesn't answer the question, and it doesn't even give us a little hint where we go, oh, I think I know why. It just lists those tribes, and then it immediately in verse 10 goes into the second vision, into the new vision. So our options are, we can just ignore it, which is okay. Just ignore it and press on.
Since we don't know the reason for the omission, why speculate?
Or the second option is generate wild and fantastic theories, and that's where everybody puts their check mark and say, yeah, I want to be a part of that group. Or there's a third option. There's a third option, and that would be the option of, since we know Revelation is so thoroughly grounded in and based on the Old Testament, will the Old Testament story of the tribes help us out?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
That's the direction we're going to go in with the second half of our study tonight. So let's talk about, we're going to start with the big one, and that is Dan. Let's talk about Dan. It's that omission, as I say, that generates all of the interest and speculation. So why is Dan not here? There are several. We're going to look at 3 proposed answers, and I'm going to focus on the third one. So the first answer, you can probably already guess because we've run across this before, and that is the answer that the tribe simply died out. And you know what? If they did, that's a great answer. And that's a perfect answer. That is exactly what we would be looking for. 12,000 men from these tribes are being sealed during the tribulation period. If there are no Danites, then they can't be sealed. So it is an absolutely perfect answer. It would answer this whole problem if it were true. If it were true, then it would answer the problem. We've looked at text, but I'm going to give you a new one that I haven't given you. We're not going to turn there, but you can just think of it. And that's 1 Chronicles chapters 4 through 7. This is a Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Chronicles are written after the Babylonian captivity, after the exile and return. So they are some of the last books written in the Old Testament would be 1st and 2nd Chronicles. And in those early chapters, 1 Chronicles 4 through 7, you have a listing of the tribes and of the descendants, and guess who is not in those chapters? Dan. Dan is not in those chapters, but guess what else? Be careful when someone gives you a statement that in itself is true, but the implication that they are taking you to is not true. That is a true statement. When they say, now you got to remember, Dan is not there. If that was all the truth of 1 Chronicles 4 through 7, I would go, that's interesting. It still wouldn't, I have other verses, so it still wouldn't satisfy me. But you have to be careful when someone makes a statement that is a factual statement, but then where they're wanting you to go, they're going to lead you down a wrong path. And I would say this, not only is Dan not there, but neither is Zebulun. So now we've got 2 tribes that are totally gone, and yet we see Zebulun listed here in Revelation 7. So that's simply not going to work. We're not going to look at this passage yet, but I'll just reference it because this is the one we need. In Ezekiel 48 and verse 1, we'll look at it before we're through tonight. In Ezekiel 48:1, Dan, way after the tribulation into the millennial period, is a tribe with a tribal allotment. So in other words, the Danites did not become extinct. They couldn't have, because we got Danites. Once you're extinct, you're gone. You can never come back.
Unless they did become extinct and
God just created a new.
Or a couple Danites, a man and a woman. But that's just
Let's don't go down that path. The second option, second answer to why is Dan missing, this is the one where everybody wants to go and they have so much fun with. So we'll just spend a little bit of time here. And it goes like this, that the Jewish rabbis, based on Daniel 11, verses 36 and following, 36 at the end of the chapter, the ancient Jewish rabbis felt that prior to the coming of the Messiah, there would first of all arise a false Messiah that would try to lead the nation of Israel astray. And this false Messiah, which that's what they would call him, this false Messiah, who is the sinister figure in Daniel chapter 11, they said would come from the tribe of Dan. Well, again, if that's true, if the false Jewish Messiah was going to be a Danite, a Jewish man, an Israelite from the tribe of Dan, then maybe you don't want to go out there sealing 144,000 or 12,000 Danites. Maybe you want to skip over them if this false Messiah is coming from them. So here are the passages that are used. You first of all you do have to go to Daniel 11. Next to last chapter in Daniel's book. And he starts talking about this figure in verse 36. The king will do according to his will. So he's often referred to as the willful king. He's a particular figure in Daniel that people who study prophecy will refer to him by the title, the willful king. The king will do according to his will. He'll exalt himself, magnify himself above every god, and speak marvelous things against the God of gods, and shall prosper until the indignation be accomplished. I mean, it sounds like an incredibly significant figure for the end times, and he definitely is. Verse 37 is the verse that they need. Neither shall he regard the God of his fathers. The Jewish rabbis took that to be a reference to an Israelite, someone who has descended from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who has cast off his allegiance to Yahweh, who is no longer following the God of his fathers, but he is going to, nor the desire of women, but he's going to, the next verse, he's going to honor the God of forces. This is going to be a military person rather than a religious person. And the Jewish rabbis were fairly confident, the ancient rabbis, that this figure would be an Israelite. So you start with that and you say, well, how do we get from that to the tribe of Dan? Well, they have to go to some other verses. So if you'll turn back to Genesis 49 and verse 17, this is this incredible prophecy that Jacob gives over his sons. In verse 1, Jacob called his sons, gather yourselves together, and I'm going to tell you what's going to befall you in the last days. And then he prophesies over all of his sons. And we've looked at verse 10 before when we were studying Revelation 5. The scepter will not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet until Shiloh come. And unto him shall the gathering of the people be. This is definitely a messianic prediction right there. And then you've got prophecies for the other sons. And then when you go down to verse 17, Dan shall be a serpent by the way, an adder, the poisonous snake, an adder in the path that biteth the horse heels, so that his rider shall fall backward. And they say, well, the serpent is the devil. And so this is some type of reference to the devil himself, or at least the devil's emissary. And then if you look in Deuteronomy 33, in Moses, both Moses and Jacob have these interesting prophecies and predictions over the 12 sons or over the 12 tribes. Deuteronomy 33 and verse 22. The imagery has changed from a serpent to a lion, but, the devil walks about as a roaring lion. This also could be a figure for some powerful but evil figure. And Dan, he said, Dan is a lion's whelp, and he shall leap from Bashan. And then one other verse that they definitely used was Jeremiah. It's probably the one in Daniel and Genesis, and then the one in Jeremiah. That's Jeremiah 8 and verse 16, were the primary text that the early Jewish rabbis would use. So in Jeremiah 8:16, the snorting of his horses was heard from Dan. The whole land trembled at the sound of the neighing of his strong ones. For they are come and have devoured the land and all that is in it, the city and those that dwell therein. So it's just a very popular theory among the rabbis. And I do not want to go into the history of the rabbinical interpretation of all of that. But I think you can probably tell just by looking at their proof text. Those are real sketchy. Those are mysterious passages. They're difficult to interpret. They need to be interpreted and exegeted in their context. If you start with a theory that I'm trying to find a sinister figure, then maybe you can find a sinister figure in those passages. But I don't think that to me is just such porous evidence for coming up with, well, the reason that the tribe of Dan is kind of a no-no tribe among Jewish or Israelite people is because of these prophecies, and we're going to say that the Antichrist is going to come from them. I just think it's so porous. It's just, you can make so many things out of the adder and the lion and the horses snorting. And it's definitely taking all of them, especially the one in Jeremiah, just out of its context and just making it say what you want to say. I don't think that's very good Bible exposition. Be that as it may, the early Christian writers jumped on the back of the Jewish writers because the Jewish rabbis did not see two comings. They saw a coming of the Messiah. They did not understand. They were confused. How can he come as one to suffer, Isaiah 53, and how can he also come as one to rule over the nation, Psalm 2? They could not understand that. The Christian writers had the benefit of knowing that there are two advents, that Christ came in his first advent and that Christ is going to come again in his second advent. And they also had the benefit of knowing that there most definitely will be a sinister figure that comes on the scene before the second advent of Christ. They knew it from Jesus' teaching. They knew it from Paul in 2 Thessalonians 2. They know it from Revelation chapter 13.
And from the Old Testament.
And they knew from the Old Testament. But they really clearly know from the New Testament that there is a first advent, and there's no sinister figure that preceded that. There was John the Baptist that preceded that. But then there will be a second advent, and there will be a terrible figure, the world's Messiah, that will come before him. And so they would use a passage like John 5 and verse 43. And by the way, they would be in agreement with the rabbis' interpretation of these Old Testament texts, but they're going to need their own in the New Testament as well. And I don't really need to turn there. Basically, Jesus says, if I come in my Father's name, you will not accept me. But if someone comes in their own name, you will accept them. John 5:43. So an example, Irenaeus, in the late 2nd centuries, in his volumes Against Heresies, taught that the Antichrist, see now the Christians have a name for him. He's not just this sinister figure, they actually have a name for him. He's the lawless one, the man of sin, the son of perdition, the beast, the Antichrist. They have a lot of names for him. They knew this is a figure. So Irenaeus, late 2nd century, only 100 years removed from John writing the book of Revelation, is agreeing with the rabbis saying that what you rabbis said is a sinister figure, we know to be the personal Antichrist, and he will come from the tribe of Dan.
Well, where do you get tribe of Dan from John 5:43?
You really don't. You get it if you kind of are leaning in that direction from what the rabbi said. Then you see John 5, and then you see Revelation 7. The tribe's not there, so I've got to come up with an explanation for why. And that's why I said there are three different paths we could take. We could just ignore this and press on. We can come up with wild theories, or we can say, well, let's slow down and let's go back and see, is there something in the Old Testament? And so the rabbis did that. Of course, they didn't even have or believe in the New Testament, but they're still looking for who is this sinister figure and from which tribe could he possibly come. And then I'll give you a quote from Hippolytus, who was another early Christian writer. He said, as Christ was from the tribe of Judah, so will the Antichrist be born from the tribe of Dan. Okay, but you know what? None of this, all of this is talking about Dan, none of this helps us with the tribe of Ephraim. Helps us with Dan, maybe, but none of this helps us with the omission or the hiding of the name of Ephraim. So what my mind would say is it possible that Dan has been omitted and that Ephraim's name has been subsumed under his father's, and that those two acts have something in common? Could those two acts have something in common, and therefore there is a connection there? And I would say maybe so. Maybe so. So what I want to give you is, it's definitely just a theory because the Bible doesn't tell us. So I'll tell you that in advance if everyone wants to know. Tell me the reason why Dan isn't here. The Bible doesn't say the reason Dan is not there is X, Y, Z. But if you think through this and you eliminate bad ideas and you say, well, what is it about Dan and Ephraim in the Old Testament that might lead me to some better understanding of an exclusion of one and the hiding of the other, then I would go to this topic right here. Idolatry. And we're going to talk about Dan, and then we're going to talk about Ephraim. Both of these tribes, the Danites and the Ephraimites, had an early and extended history of idolatry. Not that all the tribes didn't fall into idolatry, but these two were early and they were extended. Dan began first and was the most egregious of the two, but they both have this history. So let's start with Dan. If you'll go back to Joshua chapter 19, here we have in Joshua 19 verses 40 through 47a, maybe we don't even need to read it. I can just tell you, here is his allotment. And his allotment, especially if you look at 47a, just the first half of that verse, his allotment to the tribe of Dan, there's so much I could say. And he's the last of the tribes, by the way, to get his allotment for whatever you want to make of that. He's the last of the tribes. They had already given 5 and there were 7 left. We saw that in an earlier, maybe that's in the first couple of verses, I don't remember, chapter 18. There still remain 7 tribes. So then they give the allotment for those tribes, and Dan is the last one. And it shows a dissatisfaction with and a complaint over what God had given him, which is very interesting. So dissatisfied with what God had given him that the Danites totally forsook their divinely appointed allotment, traveled to the far north, came upon the city of Leshem or Laish. Now you can go back to this map. Here's the Danite allotment right down here on the Mediterranean coast. Originally given.
Not given up. They weren't given up north.
That's right.
That's what this verse is telling.
That's right. That's what this verse is saying. They go up to the far north, and at the headwaters of the Jordan River, you see that little word Dan, where that was the city of Leshem or Laish. Those were a peaceful people. They didn't bother anybody. It said they're far from the Zidonians, from the Phoenicians over on the coast. They didn't have military assistance. They weren't in alliance with neighbors. They were just a peaceful, peace-loving people. The Danites, who were very unhappy with what God had given them, abandoned their allotment, traveled north, and slaughtered all of those people and took over their property. That's the history of the Old Testament. That's the history of Dan in the Old Testament. And that is found in, like I said, Joshua 19 verses 40 through 47a. But then let me read you in the end of Judges 1, it tells us why. Now look, the passage in Joshua just said there wasn't enough land. And that's just a brief statement. It wasn't because there wasn't enough. It was because the author of Judges tells us exactly why it wasn't enough. There was enough land for them. They were not a big tribe. The reason that they were unhappy is because they lacked faith in God. They did not drive the Amorites out, who were taking the prime property down in the valley. The Amorites had sent them up to the mountainside. Well, you can't farm very well up on the side of the mountain. You need to be down in the valley where all of your water sources are. So their whole problem wasn't that God didn't give them something that was perfect and beautiful for them. The problem was their unbelief. Yeah. And this is what we read in the end of Judges 1. Verse 34, the Amorites forced the children of Dan into the mountain, for they would not suffer them to come down to the valley.
What's the verse again?
Judges 1:34.
I remember reading that, but I remember.
A lot of these people had chariots. They had iron-plated chariots. That's why they could control the valley regions, but chariots can't go up the mountains. So they control the valley. They pushed the children of Israel into the mountains. And that wasn't God's plan. God said, if you will trust me and believe me and go in and take the land, it's yours. I've given it to you. It's a divine right of yours. Go in and possess it. But you have to go in and fight. And if you look at the enemy and say, I'm too afraid to fight, well, then guess what? You don't get the land then. And so that's exactly what happened with them. And then Judges, the whole chapter 18, tells the whole story. The entire chapter is about the Danites' migration from their tribal allotment to the headwaters of the Jordan River. And I just don't have time to read that. So here they are way up in northern Israel. They have forsaken their allotment. And let's come back to this subject of idolatry. And then whenever the kingdom divides on Solomon's death between Rehoboam in the south and Jeroboam in the north, according to 1 Kings 12, verses 28 to 30, King Jeroboam sets up a golden calf cult. Where? In Dan. That's where it's set up. And it's set up in this Dan up here. We're going to get to Ephraim because he's going to set up another one down here, and I'm going to explain that in just a minute. So keep in your mind, I know this is a little hard, but keep in your mind idolatry, and keep in your mind that whenever the kingdom was divided, the major northern cult center for the golden calf set up by King Jeroboam was set up in Dan.
For a reason, I'm sure.
And I'm going to tell you what that is here in just a minute. So now let's come to the next tribe. I'm saying, is there some kind of connection between these two tribes, why both of their names are missing in Revelation 7? So now let's come to Ephraim. Ephraim, as you can tell from your tribal allotment, is right here in the very center, had some great territory right in the very center of Canaan land. As time went on, it became the big, most important tribe in the whole northern kingdom. And proof of that is as you read in the prophets, such as Hosea 4, verse 15, all the way through Hosea 5 and verse 14, and many other places. Ephraim becomes so important that the northern kingdom of Israel can simply be called Ephraim. So the minor prophets will talk about Judah, which means anything down south. Once the nation split in 931 BC between Rehoboam in the south and Jeroboam in the north, then this became the southern kingdom called Judah, right? This became the northern kingdom called Israel. But as time went on, Ephraim became such an important tribe that this northern kingdom could just be called Ephraim. And when you said Ephraim in Hosea, you're not talking about this tribal allotment. You're talking about everybody up there.
Tribes that are up there.
You're talking about all, yes.
Tribes
You're talking about everybody that's up there. That's how important that tribe became. Okay, so Jeroboam set up a southern golden calf cult worship, and that was in Bethel. Now on your map, you'll see Bethel is actually in Benjamin, but you got to remember, as I think I've intimated before, that these tribal boundaries there was no Berlin Wall between all of these. They were somewhat fluid. For instance, some of these cities, if I remember correctly, some of these cities down here in Dan's tribal allotment were actually taken over by the Benjamites. So those tribal lines you see here, just got to keep in your mind, they are an approximation, that they were fluid, that they could move. Sometimes the Canaanites would increase, sometimes another tribe would increase on the territory. And so on this map, even though Bethel is way up here in the northern part of Benjamin, it actually became part of Ephraim's territory. So that he had these two cult centers. He had one up here at Dan, and he had one down here at Bethel. They were golden calves. This is 1 Kings 12, 28 to 30. And guess why? You can probably guess why. He's got one as far north as you can go and as far south as you can go. Because King Jeroboam's goal was to keep the people in the northern kingdom up in the northern kingdom and keep them away from Jerusalem. He did not want them going down and assimilating with the true worshipers and with the true worship of God. So you put one way up here. It's like having a grocery store, at both ends of town. This will satisfy those people and this will satisfy those people. You've got this cult worship way up here. So anybody who lives up north of the Sea of Galilee, these tribes up here, they can go do their idolatrous worship at Dan, and the ones that live down here can go to the southern cult worship and do their worship there. So this is a huge situation for these two tribes, for Dan and for Ephraim. This is a long, long history of idolatry. And so then you may raise the question, well, of all the sins that Israel was committing in the Old Testament, and that they were legion, whether it was adultery or lying or stealing from the poor or failing to give God offerings or failing to observe the Sabbath, you could just list 30 things. Israel was a sinful people. So of all the sins of Old Testament Israel, why is this particular one of idolatry so important that maybe it's highlighted by not sealing the Danites and downplaying the sealing of the Ephraimites by hiding their name under Joseph? This is a suggestion of mine. It's a theory. And if you have a better one, I'm happy to hear a better one. But I think there is a reason. Whether we can get to it or not, there's got to be a reason why Dan's not there and Ephraim is hidden. So why this sin, idolatry? We don't think much of idolatry in America. We just don't think much about idols. But idolatry and the prohibitions against it were foundational to Israel as a nation. That's how the Ten Commandments start off. When God said in Exodus 20, he starts Exodus 20, verse 1 or verse 2, I am the Lord your God that brought you out of the land of Egypt and brought you out of the house of bondage. That's the preamble to the Decalogue, to the Ten Commandments. Because I have done these things for you. I am the Lord your God that delivered you from Egypt. Commandment number 1, thou shalt have no other gods before me. And commandment number 2 is like it. And thou shalt not make any graven image of the likeness of anything. You can't have another God. You can't have any kind of picture of another God. Those are the foundational, the first 2 commandments. So I'm saying, if we're asking the question, why of all the sins of Old Testament Israel, would this be important so that by the time we come to Revelation 7 and we're talking about Israel, we're still talking about Israel. We're talking about the 12 tribes of Israel because it breaks the first two commandments. Because it breaks the first two commandments. But that's not the only reason. That wouldn't be enough in my mind to say, well, but why still would those two over the subject of idolatry be omitted?
Because other tribes also, the Bible, were committing idolatry. I guess they were going up there to Dan's territory worshiping the golden calves.
Those were still the two tribes that were the idolatrous tribes, Ephraim and Dan. And I'm still trying to find a way to connect, why. We know those are the two names not mentioned. The other names are all there. So I've still got to deal with those two names. Then besides just simply being a failure to keep the first two commandments, then I would also say a second reason is, what is the particularly damning sin, now listen to this, of the tribulation period? What kind of sin is going to be committed? Murder? People are going to be murdered. People are going to be stolen from. They're going to steal the food. They're going to kill the fifth seal or the death. What is the particularly damning sin? It is taking the mark of the, it's worshiping the beast or taking the mark of the beast. That's what the tribulation, that's what the book of Revelation is going to be about. So if that is the particularly damning sin, and it is the damnable sin of the tribulation.
Because it clearly says, whosoever took the mark of the beast was...
Don't worship the beast, don't receive the mark of his name or the number of his name. Do not have anything to do with this false Messiah, with this Antichrist. Because to do that, you are not worshiping the Lord your God, who has brought you out of the land of Egypt. So, is it possible that 3,000 years later, from when Dan and Ephraim did all this, 1,000 years BC to 2000 AD, that God would remember this 3,000 years later? Would God not seal 12,000 from the tribe of Dan because they were the idolatrous group that went up there and slaughtered these people and established this shrine up there? And there are other things in the end of Judges that we didn't have time to look at. Well, I think it's possible. And is that enough of a reason why God's still got to have the 12 tribes? We're still going to have 12. But he doesn't use the name of Ephraim, but he's got to include Ephraimites. So he simply, because their history of idolatry did not extend to as early a period of time as did Dan's, that he does still seal 12,000 Ephraimites, but it's like he doesn't totally acknowledge it by hiding them under the name of Joseph. So that would be my possible explanation. And other than that, text doesn't say, the text doesn't even hint, and the context doesn't even hint. You have one new map tonight, and I want to close with this. If you'll turn over to the last chapter of Ezekiel while you are pulling this new map out, then I will conclude with these comments. Because here in Ezekiel, which I'm sure by the time we get much, much later in Revelation, we will be able to actually talk some about Ezekiel, the last 9 chapters, 40 through 48, which I believe are a description of a millennial city, of a millennial temple, of a millennial sacrifice under the Zadokites. There's a prince. There are all kinds of things that I believe are post-tribulational that happened during the millennium. And so here in Ezekiel 48, which is like the inauguration of the millennium, guess what we have? We have a new allotment of the 12 tribes. We have a new allotment. You'll see this in verses 1 to 7, and then you'll see the rest of it in verses 23 to 27.
It's interesting, the first tribe given an allotment is Dan.
And the first tribe given in the allotment is Dan. We no longer have Levi in this tribe, in this list. We no longer have Joseph. We are back to the 12 tribes of Israel as we saw them once Levi was separated and Joseph was given the double portion with Ephraim and Manasseh. We have those 12 tribes. We have those 12 sons. So Ephraim and Manasseh are here. Dan is here. Levi is not. Joseph is not. And in verse 1, the end of verse 1, these are his sides, east and west, a portion for Dan. So were the Danites extinct? Of course not. They're here in the millennium. Were 12,000 of them sealed during the tribulation? No, they weren't. But did Danites survive the tribulation period? Yes, they did. It's just 12,000 weren't sealed.
So that implies immediately that just because you're not listed as having been sealed doesn't mean you're completely wiped out.
That's right. And so here is the new tribal allotment. We'll talk about this at some much, much later point. But it's interesting still, and I'll say this in conclusion tonight, that the tribe that is the furthest away from the capital complex, from the new city and the millennial temple, the tribe that is the furthest away is the old tribe of Dan. Look how far they are, as far north, further north than they were in Judges 18.
Oh, so the list, the order that we're given in chapter 48 is from north to south.
Yes.
That clearly, according to this map,
is the way you'll see it, yes. It's a very interesting division that you will see there in Ezekiel 48. From Dan, Asher, Naphtali. And what's interesting, when you get down to what this map, they just happen to call it the sacred district. I would probably call it the capital complex, but it's the same thing. It's where the city and where the Temple Mount are. It's where the priest has his own, the prince rather has his own private territory. It's where the priests have their own private territory. They're all from east to west, from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea in this capital complex. And notice the tribes that are so close to the capital complex. Judah, right to the north, and Benjamin, the last son of the 12 sons, to the south. All right, so that's all I had for tonight. I know that was a lot of information. I hope that it was not too confusing to all of you. If next week will be the last time I want to talk about this first vision in Revelation 7. So if you've still got questions, maybe save them for last time. And I want to just kind of reboot and go back, because I think we've been talking about tribes for so long, we've lost a little bit of our focus on the actual sealing and mission of the 144,000. So I want to review, add some things, maybe say a few new things that I haven't said before, and then we'll be done with the first vision, and the following week we'll be into the second vision of chapter 7.